Hello and welcome to Ask the Consistory, a video podcast produced by the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now the question for today's video is, how many sacraments are there? So this video is following on from my two previous videos I've done on whether absolution is a sacrament and whether marriage is a sacrament. And so I have actually addressed this question in those videos, but I wanted to do a third video just directly addressing the question of how many sacraments there are. And so the Lutheran Confessions addressed this issue in Article 13 of the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, titled The Number and Use of the Sacraments. And here, Melanchthon is addressing the fact that the Roman Catholic Church has 7 sacraments: baptism, communion, absolution, confirmation, marriage, monastic vows, and extreme unction, or the anointing of the sick and dying with oil. And Melanchthon says that the ancient church did not actually have a number and definition of the sacraments. Melanchthon goes on to define a sacrament as that which is commanded and instituted by Christ, and which has the promise of grace and the forgiveness of sins. Hence, Melanchthon regards the sacraments as baptism, absolution, and communion. Melanchthon also says that if by ordination you mean the office of the ministry, then ordination could be considered a sacrament, since Melanchthon defines a sacrament as a means of grace, and the office of the ministry is the means by which the means of grace is given. So you could in some way have 4 sacraments in the Lutheran Church, depending on how you want to understand ordination. But Melanchthon goes on to speak about whether marriage can be considered a sacrament. And he basically says no, marriage is not a sacrament because it's not a means of grace. He says, even though it's commanded by God, and it has promises of God tied to it, it is not a means of grace. It doesn't forgive sin, so therefore marriage should not be considered a sacrament. However, Melanchthon goes on to say, if you want to define a sacrament as basically holy things, those things that are instituted by God, those things that have the command of God, and have the promises of God tied to them, then you could possibly consider marriage a sacrament. However, he says, if you're going to define a sacrament in this way, then things such as the government, prayer, almsgiving, and trials and tribulations, or affliction as he calls them, could also be considered sacraments, for they are commanded by God, and they have the promises of God tied to them. God does command us to pray, and he does promise to answer our prayers. Therefore, if you want to define a sacrament as those things commanded by God, which have the promises of God tied to them, then you should consider prayer a sacrament. Melanchthon even says, if we were to consider prayer a sacrament, this might, encourage more people to actually pray. And so, essentially, what a sacrament is depends on your definition. And Melanchthon finishes this section by saying that no intelligent person will argue about the number or terminology of a sacrament as long as those things are attained that God has mandated and the promises that God has tied to them. So, what are the number of sacraments? Well, it really depends on how you want to define this. Martin Chemnitz in his Enchiridion does not consider absolution a sacrament, for he defines a sacrament as something that must have a physical sign. Hence, Chemnitz only considers baptism and communion a sacrament because baptism has water and Holy Communion has the bread, body, wine, blood of Christ. So, if you want to define a sacrament as something that has physical means attached to it, then only baptism and communion are sacraments. Therefore, there'd only be 2 sacraments. If you want to define a sacrament as a means of grace, then you must also include absolution. And as Melanchthon said, depending on how you want to define ordination, you could possibly also include ordination as a sacrament. But if you want to use a very broad, wide-reaching definition of a sacrament as merely something that is commanded by God and has the promises of God tied to it, then you can include everything from marriage, government, prayers, almsgiving, afflictions, for all these things are commanded and instituted by God, and they also have the promises of God tied to them. And so, how many sacraments are there? Well, it really depends on how you want to define them. If you define them really narrowly, you're only going to have 2, maybe 3 sacraments. If you want to use a very broad definition, then the number is not quite infinite, but you get a very large number, for there are many, many things that God has commanded us to do and has tied his promises to. And so, it comes down to your terminology of what is a sacrament. How do you want to define what a sacrament is? And so basically, in the Lutheran Church, we say, properly speaking, the sacraments are baptism, absolution, and communion. For these are the means of grace. These are the things that have been commanded and instituted by God, and Christ has tied to them the promises of grace and the forgiveness of sins. Therefore, properly speaking, there are only 3 sacraments: baptism, absolution, and communion. However, if you want to use a very broad, loose definition of sacrament, then you could have a very large list. However, for the sake of avoiding confusion in the church, it would be best not to call those other things sacraments. So, basically, for good order and for the sake of neighbor, we should just keep our definition of sacraments to baptism, absolution, and communion and not go beyond that. For if you go beyond that, you're going to create confusion in the church, for people might start thinking that marriage or prayer are means of grace and that they provide the forgiveness of sins. So I hope that answers the question, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, and God bless you.